Luckily, I still have a voice after being in my car for 2 hours because I sung the whole way up here.
Well, as long as you can sing all the way back, that's...
Oh, that's a guarantee. That's going to happen. That's cute. Yeah. I used to drive cross country, and after 10 hours, I'd have no voice by the time I got home. So, and I have satellite radio, which means I can just change the channel and find what I want. So, yeah.
Ready?
Yeah, if you're ready to, let's go.
All right, well, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here on this sunny afternoon. That'll be tomorrow. This is our annual Kilgour lecture. Fred Kilgour was the founder of OCLC, and when he retired from OCLC, he joined the Sills faculty and an inspiration to many students well into his, I guess, early 90s when he would still come to campus once a week. And so part of his state has funded this lecture. Actually, OCLC funded it in his honor. Every year we have a distinguished speaker on a topic that we believe is of interest to our community. And it's my absolute delight to have Kawanna Bright with us this afternoon. Kawanna is a professor at East Carolina University. She's been involved in a range of really interesting research. She's one of the people who I think within the library information science world bridges qualitative and quantitative methods, who is addressing really essential problems in equity, diversity, and inclusiveness, but looking at it through a lens that is both critical and quantitative as needed. She has been involved with at least one IMLS grant here with Brian, Sandra, and Casey. She has her own shared IMLS grant with Amy Van Scoy right now. She's a rising star in our field, and we're just delighted to have her here. You could read her more about her background, but I want to give her as much time as possible. So without further ado, Kawanna, take it away.
Thank you so much. So first of all, I'm absolutely delighted to be here. When they first asked me to come speak, I didn't know I was going to be doing the Kilgour lecture. I was like, oh, sure, I can come hang out and talk to people about my research. And then I'm like, my mom's like, honey, you have to put on a dress. I'm like, okay, put on a nice outfit. But I'm absolutely delighted to be here. Talking about my work and my research and EDI is something that I can do in my sleep. Talking about research, I can definitely do in my sleep, enough to annoy my students, of course, because my lectures are way too long. But what you're going to see a lot today is coming from my perspective of my story and why I actually came to needing to understand EDI in libraries and needing to understand how do we make improvements for our field in a way that supports everyone. And so everything starts with a story. And my story is of someone who had both a very clear view of what librarianship was, because I was one of those lucky people that got to work in a chem math library at the University of Oklahoma. And it was just me, my college roommate, who also happened to be black, and then we had a librarian, and that was just us. We were a happy little family. And the College of Engineering had a library, and we had a black student worker too. I had no clue that our field had a recruitment issue for librarians of color. No clue, because I was in my happy little bubble. I was also learning what librarianship was because our librarian was never there. She's a researcher. So she taught us how to do reference, she taught us how to do research, we helped her with her projects. And so when I decided to go to library school, many years later, I recognized what I was getting into, but I didn't truly know what the field looked like and what was going on. And I found that out by going to the University of Washington. And I'm a Southern girl, and I'm in the Pacific Northwest. And I don't look like anybody. And also, I'm also very tall, you can probably tell. So yes, that was not happening out there. The University of Washington hired me as a graduate assistant, specifically a diversity graduate assistant. And I was happy to have that stipend and go to school there. They didn't know what to do with me. They had no plans for the work I was going to do. They had no sense of what the import was of me being there. I was the only black student in my class. There were only 2 other students of color in the program as well. And the only other black student who was there was a PhD student. And luckily it was a friend of mine as well, Dr. Patricia Catapult, who doesn't actually work in libraries much anymore, but was out there for me. I got the opportunity to create my my own path, which is great. So if you're going to be out there and figuring things out, and I started identifying issues in the field that I didn't know about. So looking at collections and looking like I was doing a film collection review, and I'm like, there's nothing in here about any of the Pacific Northwest cultures at all, and it should be. So let's talk about that. Looking at our book collections, but also looking around my room every time I go to a class and realizing I'm by myself again. Now that happened a lot in Oklahoma as an undergrad, don't get me wrong. I was kind of used to it, but I didn't expect it when I got to my master's program. I didn't expect it all those years later. And so I wanted to get a better understanding of what it meant for us to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion in my classes, only if I did it myself. So if I wanted to focus on that topic, I had to pick that topic. If I wanted to focus on it in research, I had to pick that topic. If I wanted to focus on it in collections, I had to pick that topic. There was no guidance. There was no focus and no interest. Now, of course, this is something years ago. I'm not going to say how long ago that was. And we are starting to see improvements. But even as I got into the field, I was a diversity resident my first job. So once again, I'm in a situation where that's not normal for our field. I have two others who are very much like me. I'm being invited and supported with additional funds and money and time to do all this work. I'm encouraged to do things we normally don't do, like just go to a conference to be there. We don't do that anymore. If you're not presenting or doing something of import, you don't go to just a conference to hang out. And we did that because they wanted us to get that sense of what was going on. At the same time, I was put on a pedestal. I was told, you're here to represent our library. Make sure we look good. We're starting this program. We were the first diversity residents, so they didn't even know what to do with us as well. But we started this program, and those words weren't necessarily said that way, but that's the message we received. You're here to represent us, make us look good, because we're putting all this money into supporting you. I'm not going to talk about residencies here today. It's a whole other conversation. And there's actually a fantastic book that just came out called Residencies Revisited. It has some really wonderful chapters for anyone interested in understanding the impact of these residency programs, especially on our field and on the people who went through those programs. And don't get me wrong, my residency program was ideal in terms of supporting me and getting me where I'm at today. But it's not necessarily going to be the most supportive place for someone who's not ready to be put on that pedestal, who's not ready to be tokenized and told that they're going to be tokenized, because that's essentially what happens in those programs. And so for me, what I started seeing was all these issues in terms of equity, diversity, inclusion, and I couldn't put them all up here. I just grabbed the ones that really stick out to us. We knew we had an issue with recruitment. We've done things to try to solve that. But we also know we have an issue with retention. We don't know what it looks like. That's what we're working on. But we know there's an issue. Working in libraries, I found out there were issues with promotion. How do I even move through the system? How do I get supported to move through the system? Accessibility, not even just for me, but for some of my colleagues. Buildings aren't built for us. Our offices aren't set up for us. Buildings aren't built for our actual communities either. And then microaggressions on a daily basis, mostly from people who didn't understand what a microaggression was and that they were microaggressing the people that they were working with. One of my favorite ones I always have to tell this was, I went to do a presentation at Florida International University. I'm a department head. I'm in a room with people from campus who are high rollers. I do my presentation, everything's great. I leave, my dean goes in, talks to them. Afterwards, I go back upstairs to talk to her about something else, and she's gushing about the praise that I received. And I'm like, oh, that's nice. I was there for 10 minutes. What did I do? And she says, yes, they were so impressed by how articulate you were. And she was happy about that because she didn't recognize that that was a microaggression against me. And at the time, I didn't feel comfortable telling her that in front of all the other people who were there, that that's actually not a compliment. Why wouldn't I be articulate? I'm a department head. You hired me to do this work. So why am I assumed not to be articulate at this point? And why are you surprised when I am? And so that kind of thing is happening even as I'm rising up through the levels. And then also policies and policing. I saw some of this firsthand with how we treat some of our students differently in academic libraries based on what they're doing in the library. And then the policing that we hear talked about, especially in public libraries, what's happening with our policies. They are usually detrimental to certain groups of people, and those people are usually historically underrepresented in our populations. So we see this also in our collections, in our services, in all our practices, our policies, our structures, our past, our present, and if we don't change the status quo, we're going to continue seeing this in the future. And this is why I do this work. This is why I continue doing this work. So in terms of EDI research, we also have a few other things to consider. This is something that we talk about a lot. There's a lot of anecdotal things that we think we know about the experiences of libraries of color, about the experiences of those who might have disability status, We have a lot of anecdotal information about that. And I don't want to discount that information. Our stories are important. But unfortunately, we have too few of those stories. It's the story of a few and not the story of many. We have to consider how to do this empirically. We have to do solid research on this. Because empirical research is going to help us move beyond the surface, move beyond that upper level story, and it's also going to help us identify the trends. I always go back to the retention question. We talk about what we think we know in terms of retention of librarians of color. We give you numbers that are based on usually ALA membership. It's not a correct number. We also give you numbers that are based on what we think, whether people are in the field or not. We don't know. No one's actually tried to figure that out. We also need to identify solutions through this research. If we're going to fix things, we need to do this from empirical research. And then, of course, this will help us verify those experiences. The point of the empirical research will help us to go back and say, I told you so, right? There's my story, I told you so. But what research cannot do for us is solve all of our problems, because the biggest issue we have is action. We have a lot of great things that are already coming out in research. The trends are actually starting to show up. We don't have anybody doing anything about it, and that's going to be our next step as well. And so I talked a little bit about problematic EDI research in terms of, we talked about the singular experiences that are out there, the anecdotal conversations. Also low sample sizes, because there is such a thing as survey fatigue. And every time a study comes out where they're like, if you identify as a librarian of color, please complete the survey. At one point, I think I saw 10 in the space of 6 weeks. That's too many surveys for a very small group of people. Also, survey fatigue that creeps in there, but also lack of availability. We also don't have enough people to truly do that type of research, to just continue doing all the surveys. The devalue of EDI topics within research. And for a long time, if you were doing research on the EDI and LIS, getting it published was very difficult. There were only a few journals that would take your work. And I actually received a comment once that we're not interested in this at this time. Okay, find somewhere else to publish it. Where am I going to take this now? But that happens, it also happens in terms of this idea of the changing popularity. So when is diversity in vogue? When is it out of vogue? Recently it's been in vogue. We've had a lot of things happen. The pandemic has helped us to expose some things. So we're in vogue right now. I'm a consultant. I'm in vogue. Eventually I'm not going to be in vogue. They're going to invite me in to pay me money. But right now I'm in demand because this is a hot topic for it. But what happens when it wanes? Even though we realize that it's still important, but it's no longer popular. We also have what I call the EDI bandwagon. And that's what happens when it does become popular and there's a conference theme. And for the first time, people who've never even thought about EDI are like, I'm going to do something on this and I'm going to publish on this. Now, on one part, that's good, especially if it's research. But then they drop it. I went to the conference, I published my article, job done. What's the next conference theme? That is not necessarily the fault of individuals. I do blame the tenure process on that. You got to publish to get through the process, and you do what you need to do to get to those conferences. I get it, but it bothers researchers like me when this is the work I do. And sometimes I don't even get accepted to that conference, but they did. And that bothers me a little bit when I think about the impact on the work that I do and the impact on others. We talk about the lack of empirical research approaches. This is for our field. I just mentioned surveys. And yes, we're doing a survey, but ours is very strong. But we often do surveys and stop at surveys. We also do really bad surveys. I use them in my classes as examples of how to fix your surveys because we need to fix our surveys. Please, please, please pilot your surveys. People will tell you when they're bad and then fix them. But there are so many other options out there. I do not recommend everyone go get a PhD in research methods and statistics like I did because that's not necessarily going to be the smart thing financially or even logically in some cases. But I learned so much about how we can approach different topics, and there are so many other options out there. And if you can't do it yourself, there are statisticians out there who are very happy to join us and to collaborate with us and apply those skill sets to the work we actually do. Identity and positionality I also talk about because we have to also think about who is telling the stories. And there's nothing wrong with other people telling other people's stories as long as they're telling it from the right perspective. It's about telling that story truthfully and not telling it from a judgmental place. We don't often see positionality statements in our work, and we need to see positionality statements in our work. We need to know what view you're coming from when you're talking about this topic. If you're part of it, great. If you're not part of it, fine. But let us know how you got here in the first place so that we can at least understand what we're seeing. We also have lack of effort to be inclusive because we love convenient samples. I'm making my students use one right now in the class because that's the only choice we have. It's 16 weeks, it's a research class, we don't have time for structure. But I explain to them that why this is problematic, and they see it when they look at their data. They're like, well, I couldn't run any comparisons over there because everybody is exactly the same. I'm like, yeah, because that's the group you had access to. When your teacher tells you only use your friends and family, they all are alike. You all agree with each other. You hang out with each other. You like each other. It works out. But also, the shifting terminology is causing problems for us in terms of understanding what we're actually researching and what we're actually looking at. And then finally, I'm preaching to the choir most of the time that I'm talking. When I go to conferences, the people in the audience are there because they're also doing the same research I'm doing. And they're interested in what I have to say, but I'm not reaching the people I need to reach. I'm not reaching the people that I'm trying to encourage to also join this conversation because that's not their interest area. And so I mentioned the terminology changes. I did this really quickly because I was interested in it. Because I told myself, have we been seeing changes in what we're finding in terms of how popular the term diversity actually is? And I only did Lisa, and of course I did not do the very strategic going through and reading every article to see what type of diversity they were talking about. You'd be surprised how much biodiversity shows up in Lisa. Don't know why. But I wanted to see if there was at least a visible trend here. And you can see from the 70s to 80s, 90s, and then look at 2000 and 2010s in terms of just articles that have diversity in the title or the abstract only. And you see where this term is popping up as a popular term. I also did multicultural, and yes, I was a good reference librarian. I used my asterisk at the end, so multiculturalism, all those things came up. You notice a slightly different trend. So it wasn't being used as much, but it was rising. And then now it's actually waning off because we've stopped using the term multiculturalism in reference to the work that we actually do. Now, I didn't have time to do inclusion, equity, social justice, anti-racism, bias. I could have gone on. But I wanted to just visually see if I could actually see what I thought I was going to see. And as an example to myself that there's a research study right here waiting to happen. I don't have time for it. That's what I see Amy looking at me right now. You don't have time for that. But I encourage anyone in this audience who would like to take this on, happy to be of help. So we are seeing a changing landscape. I don't want this to sound like I don't see positive change because I do see positive change. I am starting to see more empirical research being conducted on these topics, and we're definitely seeing people actually collect data, analyze that data, and issue reports. So we're seeing things related to diversity and representation in collections. Of course, now we're seeing that in relation to book banning and the attacks on librarians who are doing their collections. Underrepresented populations in library use is actually something we talked about a lot, but you didn't see a lot of it showing up in the published literature. Low morale, so the work of Katrina Davis, that's been amazing, and she's focused a lot on the aspects that are related to EDI and the low morale study. And then work experiences of libraries of color, that's something that Amy and I have looked at, but others are now starting to understand that you can have a different experience in the same workplace with other librarians based on the identities that you hold. And so that's where the stepping stone story comes from, because I want to talk a little bit about how I started doing actual research in these areas. And so it actually started with a conversation with Amy. And Amy asked me a very simple question based on the work that she was doing in terms of experiences of doing reference work. And she asked me, did you have different experiences at the reference desk as a librarian of color? And I said, yes. And she says, why didn't you ever tell me? Amy was my supervisor at NC State. If I were having issues related to people treating me differently, in theory, I would go to the supervisor and say, okay, things are happening and I need some assistance. It made me think back and realize that I didn't want to admit to Amy that I felt like I couldn't do my job for something I had no control over. I can't control that someone isn't interested in having me help them at the reference desk. But also I realized that I was kind of determined to push through that, like kind of keep it down and not talk about it, and that's problematic as well. But it led to including the voices of librarians of color, where we spent time talking to librarians about their reference work to see if we could surface that. Was I the only one experiencing that? I was not. It was actually pretty universal, but some of their stories are even worse than mine. I mean, there were stories about people who were accused of not assisting people because they were hanging out with a friend at the reference desk because they happened to share the same skin tone as the person they were talking to. And they were actually just helping a patron, just like they would help any other patron. And this person complained to their supervisor about them ignoring them and not doing their job. How do you combat that? How do you combat that image when it has nothing to do with you or your actions, but the views of someone else? And so this is the kind of thing that we were trying to look at and try to put out there. And I've been heartened to see people citing our study and using it as a stepping stone for their own research to better understand how this looks in terms of our collections and how we do liaison studies, different things like that. We're starting to see that as well. So I do want to talk now, though, about the study that we are involved in. So this is the IMLS grant study. And the reason why this is foremost in our head is because we're building a survey, and that process has been interesting at best. I have experience in survey design. I have my PhD. But even in that process, when you have four voices trying to build a strong survey, can be difficult. But our project is trying to get a better understanding of retention issues in our field. And yes, we are specifically focusing on BIPOC in terms of their retention issues, but we also recognize that this process is going to help us surface whether or not LIS has a retention issue overall. Are we losing our librarians, and why are we losing them? And is it different? Because we expect that the timing of loss is going to be different for our BIPOC librarians, that they're flaming out sooner than other librarians. And so we have the value of being able to look at this from the perspective of this quantitative survey, where we're going to ask all these questions related to things that we've been told impact retention. So we're told that things like professional development opportunities impact retention. We're told that whether or not you feel comfortable doing your job impacts retention. So we're going to find out now whether or not those things truly impact our retention. But we are going to follow this up with interviews, because this is the other side of the story. If you have someone who says, yes, I left the field, I want to know why they left the field. I want to hear from them specifically why they left the field. Now, we do suspect that over a span of the last few years that COVID has played a role, and we recognize that. And that's the other reason we need the interviews to surface that as well. But we also suspect that we're going to hear stories about lack of ability to move up, of microaggressions in the workplace, of feeling like you don't belong. And we want to figure out when that's happening, how it's happening, and also whether or not we can come up with solutions to put things in place to stop them from leaving before they get to that point. Now, if we find out that we need to go all the way back to library school, which we suspect is actually part of the conversation, hopefully that'll surface as well, because one of the things we're looking for are people who never truly entered the field after getting their degree, and what happened to them as well. They are part of this conversation. So the other thing I work on is something I call the DASA, because that's much easier than saying the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Self-Assessment Audit. Yes, I should come up with a different name. So it's DASA, which people think is a friend of mine, because I talk about DASA all the time. Yeah. I said, do you know what DASA did today? DASA broke Qualtrics today. But this was designed as a flexible organizational assessment tool. And it started out because a medical library in California needed cheap labor to build an assessment tool, and I was a grad student who needed money. And I was learning how to do this work, and they hired me to build this instrument, but the instrument was built for them, not for academic libraries in general. Other people heard about it. Grapevine blew up, and I was asked to create it for academic libraries. So I worked on that process many years ago. I feel like maybe 5 years ago now. And we turned it into something that focuses on helping academic libraries identify their gaps and their effort levels in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's the complete goal of what they do. Now, you're supposed to identify your issues and then start planning based on that. That's part of the process. It's a two-step process. Identify your issues, use that information to start planning for how do you correct those issues. It also helps to acknowledge that most libraries do not recognize their EDI issues beyond numbers. And some of them also don't even have the numbers. So I've worked a lot with schools in California. They can't ask a lot of questions related to identity at all. It's considered illegal, so they don't bother trying to figure out how to ask those questions. They don't know. They don't know if they have retention issues. They don't know if they have recruitment issues. They don't know if they have promotion issues. They have no clue. But they also don't know if they're actually doing EDI work. And that's what comes throughout this process. Now, I call this a self-assessment audit because the design was put together to give the audit to people, and they would use it with directions, of course. Doesn't always work, that's what I've discovered. They do better when they are guided, if they have someone there to answer questions, encourage them, and help them think through the process. And that's something I'm working on, is can I put together like a packet that they can all have for all these suggestions, maybe the choose your own adventure for assessment. If you choose this, turn left, and this is what you're going to do. So I'm working on that. But the other thing we discovered is that no matter how many times I remind people this is about the organization, they focus on themselves. And I'm like, you are part of your organization, which is important, but I'm asking you about your organization. What is your organization doing towards these different areas? And they struggle to forget their own institutional memory of things that may have happened even 20 years ago. And what I'm asking them is what's happening now? What's the organization doing about this now? And what we typically see is an inability to progress beyond what happened 15, 20 years ago. And so I'll ask them, so what's decision-making like in your library? Is it inclusive? And they're like, well, you know, the dean we had back in, I'm like, okay, here we go. What about your dean now? The current leadership. Are they inclusive? Do they include you? Do you have the opportunity to talk about these things? And they're like, oh yeah, we get a little bit of that. I'm like, so your rating just changed. You rated it non-existent. You don't do that at all. No, you didn't do that back in 1999. You do it now. So there's a lot more guidance that goes into this process of helping them understand the work they're doing. But there is still value to the conversation. And that's what we found when I ran a pilot of this with many different libraries, that the conversation itself was important, because most of the things on the data they hadn't even thought about could include anything related to diversity, equity, inclusion. It wasn't just the traditional things about, is it in your collections? Okay, what's special collections doing? Okay, we talk about that. We even talk about everything from like the mission statement, your strategies, your goals, your vision statement, all those types of things. But when you ask them about communication, how do you hear about the work the library is doing towards diversity, equity, and inclusion? Email, maybe. Water cooler, sometimes before the pandemic happened. I happened to stumble across it when I was talking to a friend about something they did. And there was no focused way of sharing this good work. When I asked them how they're acknowledged for doing DEI work, oh, we don't talk about it. I'm like, you're doing what? Yeah, I'm doing a lot of that work. Who knows about it? No one. Does it go on your annual evaluation? Oh, no, I don't put it there. It's not valued there. I have to focus on the other work I do. That's what we're starting to find out. There are so many other things that we're not thinking about that the DASA helps them to actually get down to the point of going, I've never thought about that. It's like, yeah, we need to think about that as well. And so the more important part about the DASA, and something I think is also important about this topic, is the importance of collaboration. I encourage anyone doing the audit to do it as a group. One person cannot possibly do that assessment and know every single piece of information about that library. Not even a dean or a director. It's impossible. You need multiple voices, and you need those people to talk about their work. And sometimes what happens in those groups is someone will say, okay, are we doing anything collection development? Someone's like, no, we're not really doing anything. And special collections going, we do special collections, diverse, what, excuse us? Because they just hadn't talked to each other about it. And so they get together and they find out all this really great information, and they figure out how they can actually share the love in terms of doing the work. But it's also a reminder that all the stuff I've talked about, that long list of things, this is the work of many, not the work of people. We have to collaborate on this. One person cannot possibly do all this work. The other thing we talk about is the diversity burden, or the burden of diversity. And we talk about what happens when we have issues with cultural taxation, where I'm asked to be on a diversity committee, and actually Amy can confirm this. I was asked to chair the diversity committee at NC State my first year. I had been there, 6 weeks? I don't even know anything about this organization. I should not be chairing a committee, and I actually wound up chairing 2 years in a row. Partly because I volunteered, because I was determined I was going to have a better second year than the first year. Because I really spent my first year just trying to figure out what was going on for the library in general, let alone diversity issues. So that's something that our organizations have to remember as well, that there should not be a requirement because I identify in a certain way that I'm going to be on the diversity committee. That if we're going to have a diversity committee, then maybe everyone rotates on the diversity committee at some point, and then rotates off the committee at some point and rotates onto a more fun committee, like the ones where you do parties and things like that. And then you rotate onto another committee you don't like. That's what happens. It's service. But there's this need to be reminded that we're all responsible for it. And it should not be falling on the shoulders of those just because I've been put into a category. I choose to do diversity work. I made that choice. I didn't have to make that choice, though. I could have chosen to focus on anything else. I do still do other research as well. But it is a choice of mine. It doesn't have to be a requirement of mine as well. So I talk about the benefits of collaboration just in a reminder. It's a numbers game. The more people you can throw at a problem, the more likely you are to get a solution. Also, this combines our areas of expertise and knowledge. So this is the same as mixed methods. This is why I love mixed methods research. I always talk to my students about it being the example of the fishing nets. So you got one fishing net for quantitative and one for qualitative. You got holes in one net, you got holes in the other net, because they have issues. They're not perfect. But if you can line those nets up in the right way, you cover your holes, you catch more fish, right? Same thing with the same process of doing mixed methods. Same thing if you combine expertise levels. So our grant that we're working on right now, we all have different areas of expertise. We actually hired somebody to do survival analysis. So do I know what survival analysis is? Yes. Do I plan on running survival analysis? No, not happening. But I come in with my areas of expertise. We also have Dr. Monica Colon-Aguirre, who's at the University of South Carolina. She has her own areas of expertise. Amy brings in all of her experiences as our PI, but it works because of that. And we also even have a really great graduate student, Ayanna, who does some amazing work for us and brings in that perspective that we often forget about. I haven't been a student in a long time. Ayanna is a student right now and is experiencing some of the things we talk about. So her perspective is so valuable to us. And she always asks us questions. We're like, oh, we didn't think about that. That's a good reminder. So it's a reminder that you sometimes have to have this combination to get to the actual success story you're looking for. And then also that collaborative approach that equals out to communication often opens more doors. This is what the DASA does. So even if you finish the DASA and everything's novice level, you're not doing a lot of work, you discovered a lot about yourself. You discovered a lot about each other. You found out about some really amazing work your colleagues were doing. You found some new areas for collaboration. And now you also hopefully found a path forward by having that conversation. So next steps, this is what I remind everyone, what I'm trying to do and what I encourage others to do. We have to look at our curriculum in LIS. We absolutely have to be looking at our curriculum. From the perspective of a research methodologist, we gotta fix that. I can't expect practitioners to do research if I don't prepare them to do research. I can't expect that. And if they're going into academic libraries that are still tenure track or even just for promotion, you're expected to do research. But if all I ever taught you about research was that you pick a topic, you do a literature review, and then you think about what you might do, then you can't do research. It's too hard. You got other responsibilities as well. But we also have to look at our curriculum in terms of, are we having these conversations in every single class? So I had a conversation with my colleague who teaches foundations. And she's working on this herself. She just now started teaching for us. And I asked her, so what do you talk to them about in foundations? She said, oh, I had to have a whole module I had to add. I'm like, on what? She goes, flow morale, vocational awe, all those things about librarianship that we don't often talk about, stereotypes, and how that can actually be negative for a librarian trying to do work, especially in the academic campus. She said that wasn't being talked about. We were doing all that very basic foundational stuff. And I'm like, okay. But she's trying to prepare them. And when they get to the next class, collection development, what are you doing? They're required to do diversity audit of their collection. It is required of them. When you get to the class about storytelling, you talk about different stories, you talk about different ways of storytelling. There's so much we can actually do in all our courses. It doesn't have to be the one diverse services to populations course that is an elective that we offer when the students decide they might want to take it, maybe. Which I will let you know that even though it says services to diverse populations, I talk about a lot more than that in that class. The other thing is, I shouldn't be the only one teaching that class. That's the other thing. So right now, at least at ECU, the only people who've taught that class are people who identify as people of color. No one else has ever taught that class. That has to change. Anyone can teach that class. So that's the other thing. Professional development for practitioners is another thing, and we do this, I know we do this, but true professional development that talks about EDI issues and talks about it in the way of giving people something concrete to hold on to take home and apply to their work is what we need. So not just I sat in a session that talked about cultural awareness. I know what cultures I belong to now. I'm going back to my office. I'm now culturally aware. You are not culturally aware. You took a class, great, take more classes. How do you then start teaching that class itself? How do you share that information when you get back to your workplace? The other thing is making sure that we are rewarding EDI research and focus on EDI. I was actually told when I was doing my dissertation to not pick a diversity topic. Don't do that. You don't want to build your career on that. That's what I was told. Especially once I told them I wanted to teach. Because I at one point was going to go back and be an assessment librarian. Different goals. And I said, I'm going to teach instead. And they're like, oh, okay, then you don't want to build your career on that. It's going to be too tough for you to build your career on that diversity topic. I actually picked a diversity topic originally anyway. I'm a little bit strong-willed and stubborn, as my mom would tell you. I actually wound up not doing it, though, because there was a wonderful announcement from Ithaca SR about a study they were getting ready to engage in that they were going to throw a lot of money at and a lot of researchers at, and it was essentially my And I knew I could not do it justice as a dissertation and could not also accomplish it before they finished their study. And so instead of doing this combating thing, I chose a different topic. And I actually wound up choosing something that was not diversity related, but only because of necessity, and also a passion I had for understanding the work of liaisons, because that was my other area of interest. But being told not to build your career on diversity, that's what I was told. And that's not something we should ever be telling someone. If it is important to you and you think it's important for the field and you know there's research avenues, then you can build a career on that. But being told that I probably wouldn't get tenure if I built my career on that. And even being told that it's great that you're doing this diversity work, but make sure you're doing other stuff as well. That has got to end. The work I do should be just as valuable as the work any of my colleagues do on their topics that they love, that they spend time on as well. And I shouldn't have to worry about whether I'm going to get published, or whether I'm going to make it to a presentation, or whether I'm going to get tenure, just because I chose to do diversity, equity, and inclusion as my topic. What they should be looking at is the value of the work I'm doing, what I'm applying to that work, and the impact I'm having as well. So that's enough out of me. I've talked at you probably longer than I intended to. I'd rather have some time, though, to engage in conversation and see if there's any questions about my work or other things I'm doing as well.
All right, we're open to.
I know. Yes, Lisa. In terms of, with high schools.
High schools.
High schools, actually.
Talk about organizational.
That would be, yeah, not actually, no.
All I could think about as you were talking was, would that be a tool for an organization like a LIS program?
A school program.
Yeah.
Probably because I have also been working with some consortiums who I introduced the data to their library groups, and the consortiums themselves decided that they wanted to see if it would work for them, because they're not libraries, they're different types of organizations that work with libraries. And so I actually am working with a group, and I just got an email yesterday from one of them. I have to email her back because it was too late in the afternoon, where she said, hey, this is the work we've now done on actually taking the data and turning it into something we can use in our organization. Would you be interested in sharing that on your website for other organizations? So I do think it is adaptable, and I do think it can be turned into that. I also have a public library that's also working on turning it into for them, because there are some distinctions, of course, based on type of library. There's actually even distinctions based on type of academic library as well. So that's the other thing we learned. Small liberal arts, research one, different set of questions in many cases, but it could be adapted, definitely could be adapted.
I think that's what we get at the, I need to do the work myself individually, and then we do something, but we don't really understand what does inequity look like in a system.
Exactly.
An organization. We are an organization, we are a system, and we have inequities built into it that we don't talk about because partially we don't recognize that they exist.
Exactly. And if you think about it, typically when people do the DASA, they have to decide how to form their groups. And one of the ways you typically form a group is based on your status. And so administrators, librarians, staff, and then student workers, if you could actually get them in a room and pay them. Anytime I've had them work with student workers, I tell them it has to be their work hours. You cannot require them to do this out of work hours. But typically you start surfacing different things when you have those groups work together that way. We've also found that if you mix the groups together, it can be positive or negative. Positive is that you get to hear different stories. Negative, sometimes some groups won't speak up if administrators are there or if the librarians are there and the staff are there. So keeping them separate has worked. But it's the same thing if you think about a school setting. You've got your administrators, you've got your faculty, you've got your part-time faculty who are coming in to teach as well, you've got your students, and you all have two levels of students. You've got your PhD and your master's level students. You also have your alum. I mean, these are all these different areas where you could actually have them all completing the data as well and looking at the convergence of the information that comes in as well. So yeah, so I'll add it to my list. I'm still working on cloning myself as well, and that's the second thing, is how do I get more of me? Because I do want to make sure I expand that out. And once we finish our IMLS grant, I'm looking at the possibility of actually pushing forward as doing this as part of an IMLS grant. That would be the better way to get support and also pull in a lot more people as well. In person. I've seen you on videos only.
I get that for a while, there's so much stuff and I think in terms of organization, until we see diversity as a part of our planning process, that it is not an afterthought. We start looking at it across the curriculum, because I don't know, of course, it's not. My question microaggressions. For a person who's been interested in conflict for some time, the presentation that I am as practicing, and I know I don't expect you to cover everything,
Of course.
but when conflict occurs, how can it become a teaching moment on both sides, and that somehow progress is being made? In fact, there are a lot of times when, particularly younger librarians may not feel comfortable.
Yeah.
How do that both parts, but particularly the person who the microaggression is against,
Right.
gain some sense of confidence in who they are and not have to be apologetic for what they feel because they don't experience.
Right, and not being made to feel as if it's their own thinking that it was a microaggression. Yeah, and actually you touched on something really important, is comfort level with being able to respond back. I mentioned that I was not comfortable at my stage responding back to my dean and saying that's not a positive thing, let's talk about it. But there has been recent research that talks about the idea of what we call calling in instead of calling out. So we talk about microaggressions, and usually the gut reaction is call that person out for what they just said. And calling someone out is usually going to lead to a negative reaction and also cause bad feelings, and that's not necessarily what you want to do. But calling in is inviting them to a conversation. Let's talk a little bit more about how that made you feel and why, from your perspective, you thought it was a positive thing to say. Because the other thing about microaggressions that we talk about is that there are different types of microaggressions. There are the ones that are micro insults. They're meant to hurt you, and people know they're going to hurt you. But the traditional kind of micro-invalidation or microaggression is usually not done intentionally to hurt someone. It's usually based on someone's stereotypical view of what they think you're supposed to be like. And when you don't match what they expect you to be like, they're surprised. They're happy. And they think it's a good thing. When they should never expect that about you based on a stereotype. They don't know you. And so there's this important part of having that conversation, of engaging that conversation. And part of this is teaching those soft skills in school as well. We talk about soft skills in library schools, how we teach people, especially if you're going to be in public services. Soft skills are important. But can we teach people to feel comfortable and confident enough to engage in those conversations so that they can go up to someone and say, I appreciate that you said that, but I'd like you to let you know that that makes me feel very uncomfortable. I would like to know more about why you feel it's okay to celebrate you for being articulate, when there are so many other things you could have pointed out about what I talked about today, the content of the information I shared. But even I didn't have that confidence. In fact, I have it now to say that. So,
I'm sorry, I think a little bit beyond that. Because often it's power relationship.
oh yeah,
Someone has power over you.
exactly.
You still need that confidence to be able to say.
To say that, yeah. And also to hopefully have built a type of relationship at all with that person to be able to even to raise it. Because like you said, this is a person who is the person deciding on your tenure or deciding on whether or not you're going to get promoted or get merit raises. You're probably thinking along the lines of, I have a family to feed. I have a life to take care of, so maybe I let it go. And you keep letting microaggressions go, and unfortunately what happens is those small cuts start turning to larger gashes and you bleed. And that's not something you actually want to have happen. So I agree, you're right, it's not just that confidence level, it's how do we work through the power dynamics that are there. And I think some of that also comes in play when we think about how we even teach in classes. So I encourage my students to challenge me. I speak from experience. I speak from my research, but I'm not always correct about everything. It's okay to ask me questions. It's okay to challenge something I've said as long as you're ready to engage in that conversation about why you think it's something else. And be okay with sometimes with us saying that, okay, I'm over here, you're over there, and that's perfectly fine. We may never meet here, but we understand each other. But most of my students aren't willing to do that. And I want them to do that. I'm okay with that, but I recognize that in some of their classes, they don't do that. You don't challenge your instructor. You don't challenge that person. And I want them to understand there's also a difference between challenging me based on the content of what I say and challenging me because of a stereotype where they feel like I don't have the right to tell them anything. Because I've also faced that. And so we're dealing with these really fine lines of recognition. One of my colleagues and I talk about this all the time. Students who refuse to refer to me as Dr. Bright. I'm Professor Bright. I'm Instructor Bright. No, I earned a PhD. I'm Dr. Bright. And I make it very clear that please refer to me as Dr. Bright. And so when you email me, even when I sign my email, and you still continue to refer to me as Professor, but I know I've seen you refer to someone else in an online meeting as Dr. something so-and-so when they didn't actually have a doctorate. I know right away what's going on. Even if they don't realize that that's what's happening, that it's intentional. But for me, it's something we talk about. It's part of the dynamic that happens in our classrooms as well. And for me, it's confronting that dynamic and talking to students about professionalism and also how you send an email. It's not a text message, it's an email. So.
Build on that, I think it's also persons who also don't know the history of when you were not allowed to get education.
Yep.
And all of the stories that have gone along with so many people about the difficulties they had because some people felt
Did wrong in
so,
place.
and I know when that spot is vulnerable.
Oh, yeah.
And I also know when a person does it,
Yep.
where they are coming from.
Where they're coming from. Yeah, and we talk about the importance of teaching the history of libraries
Yes.
in a way that is better than how we are now currently teaching the history of the United States. I mean, this has been a struggle anyway, where we're taking out important information because we're concerned that it's going to upset someone, and it's like, no, it's reality, it's the truth. One of my favorite things to do is watch Who Do You Think You Are, and then also Finding Your Roots, because it's just fascinating as genealogists. I do genealogy for my family, try to understand where my dad's from. We joke, my father has blue eyes, and is very light. And he asked me when I did his genealogy, are you going to find Africa for me? I said, Dad, trust me, we know you're actually black, it's okay. But he didn't know what his percentages were. So we found out he's actually very much Irish, English, about 35%, and then the rest is African. So, but there are many people who come on that show who are finding out about their histories in the United States. And it's very funny to me that one of the most important things to them is to find out, they want to know if their relative was fighting for the Union or fighting for the Confederacy. And if they fought for the Union, they're excited. I mean, you will see, it's like a celebration. I'm like, it was a deadly war over something terrible, and I don't think I want to be celebrating it. And just because you fought for the Union doesn't mean you believed in elimination of slavery or freeing the enslaved peoples. It's just, it doesn't mean anything. And they find out they fought for the Confederacy, they're like, oh, it's the worst thing I've ever heard in my life. And I'm like, no, it's not. It's part of our history. We need to have that conversation. You shouldn't be going on there being worried about that. There's other things about your history you might want to be more worried about. And so same thing happens in library school. Think about our foundations classes. Are we talking about the history of our field, including the fact that we did not allow all people to check out books, to visit libraries, that they were segregated libraries? We need to talk about that. And we don't often talk about that. I actually show a video clip from a movie related to that because it was the one, and now of course my brain can't remember the name of the movie with Taraji P. Henson. Anybody know which one this was? The NASA movie? Oh, thank you. I always forget the name of it. But there's a great scene where Octavia Spencer's character goes into a library because she needs a book on basically coding, and it's not in the black section of the library. And so she goes to get a book, and she's not doing anything wrong. She's got her boys with her, and the librarian asks her, what are you doing over here? Looking for a book. Okay, but there are books in the color section. She goes, not the books I need. And the woman says, well, that's just the way it is. And that's the piece right there that we need to recognize that it was the way it was. We were not different from any other organization or institutional setting back in that time than anyone else. And the way that we teach it, though, is that we were always better. We were always different. It's like, no, if you were in the South, it was pretty much the same. Even in California, it was pretty much the same. I mean, you had separate libraries, and separate was never equal, and we knew that. So I think it's definitely important that we remind ourselves that we have to talk about the good and the bad of our history and make sure we're learning from it, make sure we're not repeating our mistakes, because what's happening right now is that we're starting to see more and more people making the decision not to order books for their library and don't want to deal with conflict.
So today in my class, we were talking about, so the research of Amelia Gibson and I, we went up, we talked to youth of color here in the state of North Carolina, and I gave the students the articles, and I said, I really want you to focus on what the kids said, not what Amelia and I pulled out of it.
Right.
And that was so apparent in their response to what you just said, that we say we are safe, we belong, everybody belongs in the library, and these young people clearly said we do not belong.
Nope.
So it's 20, we did this before the pandemic, so 2019, 2020, and we say it,
Yeah.
but they clearly got the message, this is not a place for me.
For me, yeah, I'm not safe here.
I'm not safe here.
I'm not
and
safe
it's
here.
not even designed around me at all.
Yeah.
It's designed around this white supremacist cultural, and they didn't didn't use any of that language.
Right.
But it was all embedded in that.
Very clear.
They're, like they said. And
Yeah.
So it's not we need to teach the district, but we also need to come to terms with the fact that it's still happening right now in these places that we've said
Are safe.
and everything's well with it. But yes, I mean, I do appreciate that. I was thinking about the evaluations that we get from students.
Oh, yeah.
Amelia has given, and other faculty tell her about this. It would be interesting, like, I wonder if anybody's ever take those and then have a conversation with the students about, here are the comments that
I
you heard.
received.
And that doesn't even have to be in your class, but
No.
just the idea of, let's read this and let's see what's implicit and what's explicit and what's buried in this and where those microaggressions are
Yeah.
and where those micro insults are and where those just blatant racist comments are being made, and use it as a teachable moment, because thinking about New Hope College, you can't fix the problem if you don't recognize the problem.
Right.
And the first problem is recognizing it within that text.
Yeah.
And actually using that text as a teaching tool.
Yeah. And you can't recognize a problem when it's not a personal problem sometimes. So that's the other thing we talk about, the privilege to not have to deal with certain things because it's not in your life, but it impacts others around you. And you sometimes need to step up and say that I'm going to help. I'm going to assist with that. There was actually a really great session at Maurice about allies and what makes an ally. And I was actually helping to host a session, and I made a comment while we were trying to fix the microphones that I actually had that conversation with my mom, not even thinking about stuff, we were just talking about allies, and that her response was, well, back in the 60s, an ally was someone who would stand in front of the water hose for me. And I didn't have that mental imagery. I'm like, whoa, okay, that wasn't what I'm thinking. I think of allies who are, coming to meetings and supporting me sometimes behind the scenes. And she said, no, we thought of allies as people who were willing to die for the cause, just as we were willing to die for it as well. And that's deep. That's looking at it in a way that I never even thought to look at. And so I think we do have to recognize that, just like I talk about our students having different experiences and people in our community having different experiences and librarians of color having different experiences, faculty of color have different experiences as well. I've never had it happen, but I've met others who've had students comment on their dress, their hair. They'll say a word about the class itself and mark them down, by the way, for being unprofessional because it doesn't match what they expect to have. I was talking about privilege at a conference once, and I mentioned that it's not even just about privilege in the workplace or privilege other places. I looked at the audience, I said, when you go to the store, can you buy your shampoo? At almost any grocery store, any department store, without any trouble. Yes, I can't. I often have to find the right store. When I lived in Colorado, especially in Denver, I had to find the right Walmart that carried my brand, because not all Walmarts even carried my brand. So I would go to the different Walmarts and, oh, you don't carry that? Okay, next Walmart. Or I had to find a Sally's Beauty. That was my go-to, because they usually carried most of the stuff I needed. But when we talk about privilege, we sometimes have to take it back to just daily life as well. And so when you go get a Band-Aid, and it's listed as being a nude Band-Aid, is it nude for you? Or is it nude for other people? Same thing for nude pantyhose. My mom used to tell me about those. I didn't know what that was because I was a kid who refused to wear mine. So, but she talked about it. She says nude is not nude. Nude for us was a shade of light tan, and it didn't match anything else. And how long did it take them to create ballet shoes for dancers of color? Because I didn't know that the point of a ballet shoe was that it was supposed to blend with your toe. I'm not a dancer. But I was told that no, the reason they're that color is because typically they're pale and they're supposed to blend with your leg. Well, if you're a ballerina of color, that doesn't happen. Same thing for skaters. A lot of skaters used to actually buy lighter colored skates, and black skaters couldn't find brown skates. And so we think about this idea of privilege, and if it's that detailed in our daily lives, think about going to work. And we talk a lot about who has the privilege in your organization to speak up, who has the privilege to make mistakes in your organization. Because if I made a mistake, it became the worst thing ever. And I had to try to fix it. But I had a colleague who would make mistakes over and over and over again. And it would be, but that's just how he is. And I'm like, that's not fair. It's not fair. But that's what we're also seeing in our organizations as well. So these conversations, I teach leadership and management as well. We talk about that. We talk about conflict resolution. We talk about, because all my students say, I don't want to deal with conflict. I'm like, neither do I, trust me. But You can't just allow things to continue happening, especially if it's someone who is microaggressing other people in the organization because they think it's okay to do that and no one's told them they can't do it. Because then you're creating this negative organizational climate for this person, and then you wonder why they leave. And we talk about the revolving door. That's the other part of retention we don't talk about. Organizations who brag about their number of diverse staff they have. We've got 20. I'm like, that's great. Are they the same 20 you had last year? Probably not, because you have a revolving door. And we also know that when it comes to hiring, that we talk now. Social media has made it much easier for librarians of color to talk to each other and ask about organizations. And so I'm on a group that no one else is on social media that you have to be invited to. And the number of calls I see, did anybody work at this library? We used to not be able to do that. If you didn't know someone there, you didn't know who to ask. And so you would jump into that situation and find out all the bad things again, and then you leave, and it happens over and over again. We ask now. And so when an organization says, we are having trouble recruiting librarians of color for our organization, I ask them, what's your reputation like? If you got a bad reputation and it's out there, no one's coming. Doesn't matter if you pay a good salary. Doesn't matter if it's a great place to live. They're not going to invite themselves into a situation where they're going to be abused while they're there. And so social media has made that possible for us. Because beforehand, you didn't have those conversations. We might see each other at conferences sometimes, if we had enough funds to travel. And we might talk about that, but usually we didn't spend time talking about that. We were just glad to see other people and talk to each other. Actually, that's another good one as well. Amy and I talked about something we learned about coding and what happens when we have different experiences in life. So we were reviewing the same transcript. I had done the interview, though, and the person talked about the head nod. And what she was referring to was going into a space, looking around to see if there's anyone else like her, and not going to sit with them, not engaging, but doing a little bit of, I acknowledge you, and having the person do it back. So I'm having this person, and I'm nodding like, oh yes, the head nod. And Amy's listening to the tape, and she stops and goes, what's the head nod? What's the head nod? And so we had a great conversation about that, and it also helped me because I realized that I didn't ask certain follow-up questions that I would have asked another person. They would have answered that question differently. But this person, who I knew and had a similar background to, I understood their experience, but I, being a bad researcher, didn't ask the proper follow-up questions. So I learned something really important there as well. But it was also a reminder for us that we have to have people with different backgrounds when you're listening and doing interviews and asking questions. And we even both acknowledged that this person probably wouldn't have used that terminology if Amy had been leading the conversation. And so, because that's the other thing we talk about is the code switching that we often have to do, that I do a lot of. The way I speak to my parents, the way I speak to my brother, you wouldn't recognize me. And then the way I do presentations, the way I speak to my students, but that requirement of me that I present myself in a certain way when I'm in certain settings is not something other people are asked to do. And it reminds me of my friend Monica, who has to think about speaking in two languages. For her, that's the mental gymnastics she's doing, is, okay, how do I say that in English? And make sure I'm saying the right thing. Well, I'm kind of doing the same thing. How do I say that in correct grammar, in the proper way? Or how do I use the right term for that, and not one that someone's going to question my intelligence because I didn't use the right terms? And I think that's something we have to think about as well when we think about people who are applying to jobs, who are interviewing. Oftentimes they're being judged for the way they say things rather than the actual content of what they say.
I am thinking about that as you're talking about, hiring of academic library, but in higher education, it's the same thing. So this is the expectation of what a presentation looks like. If you step outside that norm, then all of a sudden your scholarship is one question instead of...
It's not rigorous.
It's not rigorous. It's, whatever. Again, that's the thing that we don't bring up, but it happens over and over and over. And your comment on your slide, about the research not being supported and not being published. Yes, it's better now, but it's still difficult. And that's,
it's still a struggle.
What you're passionate about, what you care about, what's so important is dismissed because it's not seen fit in the mainstream sort of way of how we do research and value. And sorry.
No, it's a good point.
I had a lot of thoughts today.
It's a good point, yeah. Which is why I talk about it. Yeah. Well, that code switching goes on for publications as well. So if you think about it, it's not necessarily the idea of changing how you talk, but you change how you present your information so that they won't focus in on the part that you actually find more important, which is the diversity piece, and focus in on the other thing you did. So maybe you do it as a methodological paper instead, and you focus on the impact of that, even though for you, the impact was on what you found by having those conversations with those people. So yeah, we spend time thinking about how to restructure our work so that it be acceptable in the way.
I want to take somebody else's question. Diane asked a little bit different sort of question. You talked about a little bit about sort of positionality.
Yes.
Could you say a little bit more about that? Because when I heard that, I was like, we're struggling now with sort of diversity statements.
Oh, yeah.
And of course,
Yeah.
compelled speech and all the other crazy stuff.
Yeah.
And is positionality kind of, is that a better term we should be using?
I think you could do it that way. I think typically I come at positionality from the perspective of a researcher. And so in qualitative research, especially if you're doing ethnographies, especially, there's this need for you to explain where you sit within the setting that you spent time in, because you probably didn't belong to that culture that you were spending time with. You probably didn't, fit in. So it's important for us to understand when you start talking about what you saw and the findings based on us understanding who you are as well. And some of that is so that we can identify issues with bias. You see someone talking about how, I was observing a class in Japan and they were teaching their students this way, this way, this way. And the response that the researcher had was, and I thought this was a terrible way to actually teach the students this possible thing. That this is, I'm like, from your North American perspective, it was. From their perspective, it's the way it's done. And so it's important for us to understand that about, as a reader, especially of the work, to understand that about the researcher, where they're coming from, where they stand in the conversation, and also maybe to understand how they got there in the first place, so why they chose that. I think the diversity statements, like the big conversation is, and this is a joke that I often tell, is like, what's my diversity statement? This is my diversity statement, right? And so there's this argument about, why I should have to write a diversity statement. University of Denver does inclusive excellence. That's there. And they asked me when I was interviewing, what is inclusive excellence to you? And my return was, wait a minute, what is it to you? I want to know what your stance on inclusive excellence is, because I can tell you a whole bunch of things, but I want to know what your view of inclusive excellence is, because I need to decide if I want to exist in your inclusive excellence lens as well. But it's that same idea of asking people to write a statement that talks about their stance. So maybe you could talk about it in terms of positionality. What's your stance on diversity, equity, inclusion? But like for researchers or for instructors, asking us, where does it fit in your teaching? Where does it fit in your research? Where does it fit in your service? And maybe doing it from that perspective. I think a lot of diversity statements are really more along the lines of, I support diversity. Okay, that's great. How do you support diversity? So I think those statements, I think they can be done well if you give someone the right prompt. But I think oftentimes the prompts are, what is your stance on diversity? And that's just such a big open door of a conversation that it's difficult for anyone to answer what their stance is on diversity. Because I want to know what your stance on diversity is so I can tell you where I think I fit within that stance. But yeah, the positionality conversation really started to happen because we were seeing a lot of things being published about librarians of color, communities of color, and we had no understanding of who was writing these articles and where they were coming from. And so what we started seeing was actually a class I was teaching on reference where there was an article that talked about making sure that we were looking at social justice within the work we actually do. And my students were asked to read this, and it was a discussion post, and they all started saying things like, I don't appreciate being called racist by this article. I'm not a biased person. I understand that libraries of color need to get their point across, but the author should have come up with a different way to do that. And I had to email them back and say the authors were 3 white women, and they clearly told you that in the article. You missed that point because you were so focused on seeing the words, social justice and diversity. And I think it's one of those gut reactions when we talk about. People have that immediate gut reaction when I start saying, I'm going to teach you how to have an anti-racist workplace. I'm not racist. Didn't call you one. What I said is that we have some racist practices that are built into our systems and we have to work on those things. Didn't call you racist, didn't call you biased. But I also remind people that we all have biases. We exist with them. The difference is what you do with those biases. And so I acknowledge that I am biased about some things, and I work on making sure I don't allow that to impact how I make decisions and how I treat people. And I also question where that bias came from. And that's a little bit of that introspection we have to do, that reflexivity we have to do to really try to understand, why do I believe that? Was that the media? Was it my family? If you ask my parents, and this is a joke I tell my dad, and we have long arguments about this, my father believes that black people are the best athletes. That's it. That's his belief. He will say that, and I'll just look at him and go, let's have a whole conversation about this. That athletic ability, genetics, what you have access to in terms of training and areas and things, all those things factor into your ability to do a sport. And that is not just automatically that you are, and you're a better athlete. I know plenty of black people who are not athletic people at all. I am a klutz. I will put that out there. I play certain sports. I don't do basketball. People think I do because of how tall I am. And we were talking about this on the walk over. I can do this. I can't do this at the same time I do this. And the fact that that's another stereotype, another microaggression, the assumption that I went to school on an athletic scholarship, I get that all the time. Oh, was it an athletic scholarship? No, it was actually academic. It was, yes, because I actually like to read a lot. But we have that issue of people allowing those biases sometimes from different generations. Because my father is definitely a different generation. My father's 83 years old. He's set in his ways. And arguing with him doesn't make any sense, but I still argue with him. Because I need him to understand that even the way he approaches and views life isn't supportive of me and the way I do life. And it's something that we have to think about, that I easily could have carried along some of those traditions that I was taught by my parents. But I mentioned I'm stubborn and nosy, and I like to read, and I wanted to understand the world better. And luckily my parents allowed me to do that instead of requiring me to fit into what they understood of the world. Because officially, if I did what they were supposed to do, is I didn't need a college degree. I could have worked at the plants like they did, and then retired at about 65 with no pension, no retirement, and a lot of health issues. But that would have been okay. It would have been okay if I'd had a child at 17 or 18. That would have been perfectly fine. I didn't need college. That would have been okay. But luckily, I had parents who agreed that I could make my own choices, and I chose college, and I chose to move forward. But it's so easy for us to not recognize that sometimes how we think about the world, how we view the world, is based on something that was taught to us many, many, many years ago. And it's kind of buried in our subconscious. And whether or not we can surface that and understand it is a whole other conversation. So, yeah. And I do still love my dad, and we do still argue. And I do tell him he's wrong about a lot of things. And I talk to him about the importance of opportunity when we talk about sports. Because he always wondered, like me, why don't we see more black people swimming? And he said, oh, black people don't like to swim. No, they didn't have access to pools. That's the reason, So why do so many black men go towards basketball? Because courts were available in the inner cities where they lived versus a baseball field they didn't have access to. So those conversations are about your environment and where you live, and trying to get him to understand that, because his environment was a very small town in Tennessee that he talks about as if it was actually Eden, and I don't know. I've been there, I spent some time there, it's not. But his view was perfect. And I think it's very important that we get people to think about our histories and our own backgrounds in terms of how that flavors the way we are now as humans. So.
One fascinating to hear professors talk about consolidation of course.
Yeah.
From their perspective, like I'm doing this. Anyway, your lectures are not too long. They're wonderful. I actually remember more from all the courses you taught than anyone else's. So that was one. And I like the fact that you are thinking about the fact, like, I know that the courses you teach, but I remember going through the EDI program, and I worked in a health equity center, so like all my days were equity based.
Yeah.
And I would go to class and there was nothing.
Yeah.
No one would talk about it. Like I would pick equity topics to do, because that's my wheelhouse. That's what I did every day. But
Yep.
I think your class and one other were the only classes that even acknowledged anything in 2.5 years.
Yeah.
So, like, senior research and like, and when you said ECU, like, changed the foundation class, I was like, oh, thank God. it is glaring this, so.
Yeah.
That's heartwarming.
Thank you. And you got a mask on, so who are you?
Oh, I'm Jamie.
Oh, hi, Jamie.
I wish I could have taken your course. I was like, there's one.
Yeah, I taught the higher level research at this course now, so, which my students are running from right now. They're very mad at me. It requires data collection. So there's a lot, and 2 are doing IRB, which is fascinating. Yeah, because we're doing IRB, and we don't like it very much. But yeah, but it's very nice to meet you, because I usually have a very small picture of my students, and sometimes I even get their dogs or their cats,
Yeah.
maybe their kids.
I still blue hair and but
That actually helps. So, and thank you for saying that, I appreciate that, because I don't often get to hear that. I do ask, but sometimes, I don't know about here at UNC, but at ECU, our students are asked to do their evaluations before class ends, which means that they're also working on their final assignments, which means they don't have time to do an evaluation.
no, they're done
See, yeah, so. I think I tortured you long enough. I know most of you have other things to do today.
Go ahead.
I really want to make a comment based on what you just said. And you hear so often, some people say that students don't want to talk about the book. I was not talking at the case.
Yeah.
Being that it's 50 years ago.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, sometimes in the writing evaluation, I wish other faculty would talk about the book.
Yeah,
So this is not something, I think, it's always risky to make something
yeah,
about the book.
yeah, it is.
And yours is another indication.
Well, I know what it just needed, because I had a class that a big part of it is the pipeline.
Oh, yeah.
I think it's a possibility, everyone to myself. And, hey, well, you can do something that you can do.
Yeah,
But so, yeah, there is a demand for it, it's just not enough to do that.
yeah. Which means I can take that back to ECU.
It's on tape.
It's on tape.
There we go.
Our students want it, let's do it.
So let's give Dr. Bright one more round of applause.
Thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate this. I know that everyone's busy, and so it's Friday, so thank you. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, they'll take care of all that.
So, one of
Do you have
yeah, let's go. Yeah, let's go see what's over there. So let them